In the summer of 1941, the world witnessed the largest and most brutal military invasion in history, Operation Barbarossa. On June 22nd, without a formal declaration of war, Nazi Germany unleashed more than 3 million soldiers, 600,000 vehicles, and nearly 4,000 aircraft against the Soviet Union. It was the moment when the Eastern Front, the deadliest theater of the Second World War, burst into flames. At dawn, the skies over the western borders of the USSR filled with the roar of engines and the thunder of artillery. German bombers struck Soviet airfields, railways, and communication centers. Entire Soviet divisions were caught unprepared. Their planes still lined up on the ground, destroyed before they could even take off. Civilians in border towns woke to explosions, black smoke, and chaos. Within hours, the front stretched for more than 1,800 miles, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Hitler's generals expected a lightning victory, much like in France the previous year. The German High Command believed that the Red Army would collapse in a matter of weeks. The Nazi leadership saw this invasion not just as a military operation, but as a war of annihilation. It was meant to destroy communism, seize Soviet resources, and enslave millions of people for the German Reich. Propaganda portrayed the campaign as a crusade for Europe's survival against Bolshevism, but in reality, it was the beginning of a war of unimaginable cruelty. The Soviet Union, taken by surprise, reeled under the initial shock. In the first month alone, entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in places like Minsk and Smolensk. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. Many would never return. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, while the Wehrmacht's armored divisions, the Panzers, advanced deep into Soviet territory. Cities fell one after another, and millions of civilians were trapped behind the German lines. But the Germans underestimated one crucial factor: the resilience and scale of the Soviet Union. As German forces pushed eastward, they faced vast distances, crumbling roads, and fierce resistance from desperate defenders. Every town, every river, and every forest became a battlefield. Soviet citizens, soldiers, and civilians alike began to organize partisan groups behind enemy lines. They sabotaged railways, destroyed supply depots, and spread fear among German troops. By late autumn, the Blitzkrieg began to lose momentum. The Wehrmacht's supply lines were overstretched, and soldiers faced the brutal Russian winter unprepared. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, freezing engines, weapons, and men alike. Still, Hitler demanded the advance continue toward Moscow, insisting that the Soviet capital would fall before Christmas. But the Red Army, regrouped and reinforced, launched a massive counteroffensive in December 1941. For the first time, German troops were forced to retreat. The illusion of a quick victory shattered. The war on the Eastern Front was no longer a campaign. It had become a war of attrition, a struggle for survival that would consume millions of lives on both sides. As the snow fell over the smoking ruins of villages and cities, one thing became clear. This was not just a clash between two armies, but between two ideologies, two visions of humanity. The Eastern Front had ignited, and with it, the bloodiest chapter in human history had begun. From this moment on, the world would witness suffering and destruction on a scale never seen before. Entire generations would be lost, and entire cities would vanish under the weight of war. The fate of Europe and of humanity would now be decided in the frozen fields of the East. By the summer of 1942, the war on the Eastern Front had turned into a merciless struggle of endurance. After failing to capture Moscow, Hitler shifted his focus southward. His new goal was the oil-rich Caucasus and the industrial city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad. The city's capture would not only secure vital supply routes along the Volga River, but also deal a symbolic blow to Soviet morale. For Hitler, taking Stalingrad meant crushing the Soviet spirit itself. In August 1942, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The city stretched along the western bank of the Volga, a sprawling maze of factories, residential blocks, and rubble. When the Luftwaffe began its massive bombing campaign, Stalingrad turned into a sea of flames. Tens of thousands of civilians perished within days, and those who survived faced hunger, thirst, and unending bombardment. Entire districts were flattened. Yet, despite the devastation, Soviet defenders refused to abandon the city. The Battle of Stalingrad was unlike any other in modern warfare. Street by street, building by building, the two sides fought with unimaginable ferocity. Soviet soldiers held on to every ruin, every floor, every staircase. Snipers hunted through shattered windows, and soldiers engaged in brutal close quarters combat with knives, grenades, and bayonets. It was said that the front line could run through the same building, Germans on the top floor, Soviets in the basement. Factories such as the Red October steel plant and the Barricadi ordnance factory became fortresses. Workers who once built weapons now fought with them inside their own workplaces. Reinforcements crossed the Volga at night under constant artillery fire. Many never made it across, but those who did joined the fight immediately, often without rifles of their own. The motto of the defenders was simple: not one step back. For the Germans, the battle was a nightmare of attrition. The more they advanced, the more resistance they met. Stalingrad devoured entire divisions. Supplies ran low, the wounded lay untended, and the freezing winter crept closer. Still, Hitler demanded that the city be taken at all costs. He refused to allow a retreat, even when it became clear that the Soviet forces were preparing a massive counterattack. In November 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus, a double encirclement that trapped the entire German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. The hunters had become the hunted. Cut off from supplies and reinforcements, over 250,000 Axis troops found themselves surrounded in a frozen wasteland. Food ran out, ammunition dwindled, and the temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Starvation, frostbite, and disease began to claim more lives than Soviet bullets. Paulus radioed Berlin for permission to break out, but Hitler's orders were clear: stand fast. He promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the army by air, but the effort failed miserably. The transports were shot down in the hundreds, and barely a fraction of the needed supplies reached the trapped soldiers. Inside the ruins of Stalingrad, German troops burned furniture for warmth and ate the meat of dead horses to survive. The Soviet grip tightened. Street by street, the encircled Germans were pushed back into smaller pockets. By January 1943, resistance had collapsed. On February 2nd, General Paulus, newly promoted to Field Marshal, an attempt by Hitler to ensure he would not surrender, laid down his arms. It was the first time a German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Of the 250,000 soldiers who entered Stalingrad, fewer than 90,000 surrendered, and only about 5,000 would ever return home after the war. The victory at Stalingrad marked a turning point in World War II. It shattered the myth of German invincibility and inspired hope across the Allied world. For the Soviet people, it was a moment of triumph born from unimaginable sacrifice. The city itself lay in ruins, nothing but rubble and ashes, but its spirit had endured. Stalingrad had not merely been defended. It had been reborn in blood and fire. The resistance of its people had turned the tide of the war. From the ashes of destruction, the Red Army would now begin its relentless push westward, toward Berlin and toward the end of the Third Reich. By the winter of 1942 to 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad had transformed from a German offensive into a slow, freezing nightmare. What began as Hitler's quest for a decisive victory had turned into a struggle for survival. The mighty German Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was now surrounded, exhausted, and dying inside a wasteland of snow and ruins. The turning point of the Second World War was unfolding in real time. When the Soviet Union launched Operation Uranus in November 1942, the German High Command was caught completely off guard. The Red Army struck the weaker Romanian and Italian divisions guarding the German flanks, smashing through them with overwhelming force. Within just a few days, the Soviet pincers closed around Stalingrad, trapping more than 250,000 Axis soldiers. Tanks, artillery, and supplies were left behind in the panic. What had been an assault became a siege. Inside the frozen cauldron, the Kessel, as the Germans called it, discipline began to erode. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Men who had once marched across Europe now scavenged for frozen bread and dead horses. Frostbite turned fingers black, and medical supplies ran out. Ammunition was rationed, and the wounded froze in makeshift shelters among the ruins. Disease spread rapidly. Yet Hitler's orders were clear: the Sixth Army will stand fast. Stalingrad will be held. In Berlin, the Führer still dreamed of victory. He refused to allow Paulus to attempt a breakout, insisting that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air. Hermann Göring promised that his planes would deliver 500 tons of supplies per day. In reality, they managed less than 100. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns turned the airlift into a massacre. Transport planes were destroyed one after another as they tried to land on the icy Stalingrad airfields. Each flight that did manage to land brought only a fraction of what was needed, and often carried away only the wounded officers, leaving thousands behind. The men on the ground began to understand the truth. They had been abandoned. Letters home spoke of despair and disbelief. "We are like ghosts," one soldier wrote. "The snow covers the dead, but there are too many to bury." Entire units disappeared in the white silence, frozen in their foxholes. Hunger consumed them from within. Horses, dogs, and even wallpaper paste were eaten to survive. The once mighty army of conquest had been reduced to a starving, freezing mass of broken men. Meanwhile, the Red Army tightened its grip. Soviet artillery shelled the shrinking pocket day and night, and infantry assaults hammered the German positions from all sides. Soviet soldiers shouted through loudspeakers, urging the Germans to surrender. "Your situation is hopeless," they declared. "Lay down your arms and live." But Hitler's propaganda still reached the front lines, demanding the impossible: fight to the last bullet. By January 1943, the situation was beyond repair. The Sixth Army had split into two isolated pockets, one in the north, one in the south. Communication lines were cut, and the last airfield fell to Soviet forces. The wounded lay dying in cellars with no food, no medicine, and no hope. Paulus radioed Berlin again, begging for permission to surrender. Hitler's reply was simple and cold: capitulation is forbidden. Instead, he promoted Paulus to field marshal, knowing that no German field marshal had ever surrendered in history. The message was clear: die with honor. But Paulus refused to be a martyr for Hitler's delusion. On February 2, 1943, surrounded by ruins and corpses, he made the decision to end the battle. The remaining 91,000 soldiers surrendered to the Soviets. They were exhausted, starving, and barely human. Few could even walk. Of those who went into captivity, less than 6,000 would ever return to Germany, most dying of disease, hunger, or cold in Soviet prison camps. For the Nazi regime, the loss of Stalingrad was catastrophic. It shattered the illusion of invincibility that had followed Germany since 1939. Across Europe, morale faltered. Even in Germany, whispers of doubt began to spread. The world saw that the Wehrmacht could be defeated. For the Allies, it was a sign of hope, a turning of the tide in a war that had seemed endless. In the ruins of Stalingrad, amid the ashes and snow, a new reality emerged. The Red Army had not only defended its homeland, it had struck a fatal blow against the heart of the German war machine. From this moment on, the Soviets would never again be on the defensive. The tide of war began to flow westward, through Kursk, through Belarus, through Poland, until it reached Berlin itself. The fall of the Sixth Army was more than a military defeat. It was the collapse of an ideology built on arrogance and hate. It marked the moment when Hitler's dream of domination began to crumble. Out of the ruins of Stalingrad rose a grim truth, that even the strongest armies can fall, that even the most ruthless empires can break. The frozen fields of Stalingrad became a graveyard not only for men but for the illusion of Nazi invincibility. It was there, in the ruins of a city that refused to die, that the course of history was forever changed.